So although we can debate at this conference whether nanotechnologies today represent upstream or midstream development, and we actually haven't discussed that much yet so far, at least not in the sessions I've been in, and I'm surprised. But in terms of public perceptions, nanotechnologies remain very much upstream. And Dave Berube talked a little bit about this morning. And at CNS-UCSB, we've conducted a meta-analysis of all the published surveys from around the world that's currently in press with Nature Nanotechnology, and it shows quite clearly that public awareness or familiarity continues very low. This paper today, this presentation, and the longer paper that this is attached to, discusses work that asks how and through what processes technologies that barely exist in the public's awareness are always already profoundly gendered, raced, and otherwise socially marked. Further, we ask what are the implications of this for the national project of citizen inclusion, collaboration, and engagement associated with the NNI in general and our national center in particular. We argue, as others have today, that nanoethics, in a field we would call nanoethics, and I also don't care for that term, and I think I prefer to talk about values and cultural values than ethics. But nanoethics, if we accept that term, needs to consider the politics of difference at all levels in the societal implications of nanotechnology project. The research I'm presenting today is part of a collaborative research project by a large international collaborative team. I counted it up for this presentation. At this point, the team includes 3 anthropologists, 3 sociologists, 2 social psychologists, 2 geographers, 2 environmental policy people, and 2 nanoscientists, a chemist and an electrical engineer. And as you heard, among the several other hats I wear, I'm a professor of feminist studies. Other contributions to the work I'm discussing today include my co-authors, sociologist Carl Bryant and Jennifer Rogers, who's in the room, social psychologist Nick Pidgeon, cultural geographer T. Rogers Hayden, as well as anthropologist Terry Satterfield. In this talk today, I'm going to sketch a response to the question I'm asked with, to me, astonishing frequency, which is, what in the world does gender have to do with nanotechnologies? If ever there were a contrast between the soft and the hard, that seems to capture it for a lot of people. To do that, I'm going to first set the stage for our approach to this multifaceted question by discussing how social location, and that's a key term for us, is theorized to have an effect on perceptions, including those to do with new technologies and their introduction into society. Then briefly, how we frame gender and deliberation. And then I'll describe qualitative research that we're engaged in to look at the ways views emerge in the deliberative setting. This includes a study completed in 2007 and reported earlier this year in Nature Nanotechnology, as well as a new study currently in progress. And of course, at the time we wrote the abstract for this paper, we expected to have completed that work, but in its infinite wisdom, our university chose to move our survey center this summer, and we lost our recruitment base over the summer. So we are actually running our first of those workshops next Saturday. So I'm not presenting on that future work, but on the build-up to that. And then I'm going to talk briefly about the interpretive frameworks that we use to make sense of what we take to be issues about gender and deliberation. First, a little bit of background to our approach. We are risk perception researchers, and we would point out that nanotechnologies as risk objects hold particular fascination for risk perception researchers because they seem at first analysis to display and incorporate many of the characteristics of technological risk objects that previous research has shown to produce amplification of risk and lowered acceptability. And I'm not going to go through all these, but they include novelty, invisibility, and the paper talks about these in much greater length. Where in the literature those are and how those seem to work in the nano case. But you can see that many of these characteristics are present in the nanotechnology case, and so we would think that they have a very high number of risk factors for being viewed as risky by lay persons. But what are the essential differences among different sectors of the public in the ways they actually view nanotechnologies as agents of potential harm, and what kinds of benefits figure in those diverse publics' imaginings about nanotechnologies' futures. And so what I'm really arguing in this paper, the meta story, is we've talked a lot about responsible science, but I'm arguing that responsible social science demands our attention to the politics of difference and how they play out in these important public participation contexts. The national project of nanotech R&D in the US embraces a technocratic vision of harnessing these new technologies for social benefit. And those of you with background in STS or risk studies will know that public participation in technological development has been a recognized political necessity in the US at least since the mid-1990s, with an influential National Research Council report that endorsed the analytic deliberative model. Yet, in spite of this, there's been a striking absence of attention to critical analysis of the politics of difference as a key issue in the forms that participation can and should take, the politics of exclusion as they play out in such fora, and how the body politic can be shaped by multicultural, multivocal participation. Our work asks about the gendering of technological debate in public forums while also attending to other categories of difference. Public opinion surveys in the US have indicated a consistent pattern of generally positive views of science and technology, or what we would call technological optimism, even when people say they don't know anything about science and technology. In a slightly finer-grained analysis, however, a white male effect has emerged quite consistently in the US and elsewhere, i.e. younger, better educated males consistently demonstrate higher acceptance, higher perceived benefit, and lower perceived risk of science and technology in general, and many specific technological objects, which is what is running down the left-hand side of this slide. And this is a study done by my colleague Terry Satterfield and published in 2004, a restudy of an earlier, a reaffirmation of an earlier sort of canonical study by Slovic in the 1990s. There are a couple things about this that I would draw your attention to. One is that although this is arguably shows that those three lines on the right that depict white female and non-white respondents, higher perception of risk, lower ratings of acceptability of virtually every single object there except motor vehicles. There is a lot of debate about which pattern, the white male pattern or that much more intersected women and people of color pattern, which is the exceptional or non-normative, and white male acceptance of technologies is arguably that non-normative pattern, and there's a shift in discussion going on about that right now. Nanotech survey research to date, and this is a slide, an unpublished slide from our own at the CNS from a survey we did in 2008, shows that we're finding virtually the same pattern replicated again. So this is the response to, these are sort of baseline non-nano objects that show that same gendered pattern of response, and nano, a range of nanotechnologies, including generic nanotechnologies at the bottom. We think generic nanotechnologies is something that's almost emptied out of meaning, and that response is probably indicative of it. So what do we see as the implications of these widespread patterns, which are gendered and raced, for equitable public participation in dialogue and debate about technological development and technoscience futures? Do they affect who shows up to deliberate? Almost certainly. And in our deliberative research, as Dave Berube mentioned, you do have to structure the group to create a diverse group. You do not advertise and have whoever shows up constitute your group, or it would not, certainly would not represent local demographics in any way. Do these patterns affect what transpires within the deliberative setting? And that's what we're looking at more closely Certainly, as a feminist anthropologist, I would find it hard to imagine it would not affect, but to the extent that they reflect deeper divisions in our society and cultural values, yes, I would say these definitely are expected to play out in the deliberative setting in ways that matter. The explanatory models that we draw on, I don't have time. Again, the paper goes into these in great detail. We draw from international feminist research on women in science and technology, which surprises many people when I explain that there's ample evidence for highly gendered processes through which both men and women and boys and girls view males as more knowledgeable and competent in math, science, and technology, regardless of measured competency. And both men and women similarly underestimate the abilities of women. Digital divide analyses similarly find that women and people of color have had distinctive patterns of both access and use of technologies. And of course, none of this should come as a surprise to those of us who are cultural analysts or anthropologists. We have a large literature on feminism and technology that's explored how gender shapes technologies and how technologies in turn shape gender. While there are a number, so I'm shifting now, I've been talking about how risk perception is gendered. We have a lot of evidence about that. We have a lot of reason to expect that that plays out in the deliberative forum in ways that we think are important to take note of. And now I'm shifting to the issue about gender and deliberation and engagement. And again, there's a lot more in the paper about this, but we are drawing primarily from the UK model of upstream deliberation, partly because Nick Pidgeon, who's been part of that effort, is a close collaborator on this project. And again, that upstream aim of pursuing public dialogue before irrevocable decisions have been made is proving complex and difficult in many, many ways, not the least of which over 1,000 nanotech products are already in the marketplace. And the discussion of yet-to-be-invented products is proving novel, providing novel challenges from a research methodology standpoint. And although the UK model has been a useful base for us to operate, and we've done comparative work with the UK to provide baseline comparison with the US, we have found in our work that the US seems to have little or no existing framework for such interactions, no such direct links to policymakers that are found in the UK context. And as we found in our research, little cultural knowledge in circulation about how such mechanisms would work. In addition, engagement intended at forming consensus for decision making, which is the main goal of most deliberative setting, expressly submerges standpoints of individuals with minority views and the race, class, gender, and other social locational features that are of critical importance in the large, multicultural, multi-ethnic U.S. context. And so we think about this as a conundrum of consensus and difference that we're trying to address in the deliberative setting, where reaching consensus is one aim of deliberation. We're more interested in bringing those diverse views to the surface, but then where does that leave you? If that leaves you with a room of 15 different views, if it's a group of 15, that's not what happens, by the way. But theoretically, that's what could happen. And then where do you go with that? So this project is part of a comparative US-UK cross-national study intended to look at national differences in perceptions of benefits and risks to new nanotechnology for applications for health and human enhancement on the one side and for energy. And we've compared, I think I'm going to go right to this because I'm going to run out of time here, but we chose health and energy applications anticipating that they would elicit very different responses, partly because in our work we're trying to explore contextual differences such as application as factors in emergent risk judgment. And the aim in this was to develop a single session, i.e. low cost, low intervention workshop that could work across cultures and use it to structure a dialogue. It's about a 5-hour workshop that we've been modeling this on. And so these are small focus group size groups, and I'm not going to go through the details of methodologies we've used. And again, those are available in our paper that came out in February, or also more details in this paper that's posted. But we did develop, we both audio and videotaped these interactions, which I think is important, and we've done detailed qualitative data analysis in a collaborative interpretive method that we sort of had to develop insight to get reasonable cross-cultural comparability in the analyses. So the study found a surprising benefits frame, and the surprising part was that we wouldn't have anticipated that for the UK about nanotechnologies for health and energy, with US and UK groups unexpectedly far more similar than different. The responses to different applications contexts, however, were strikingly different in both countries. So energy applications were seen far more positively than health and enhancement applications, and I would say that runs somewhat contrary to a lot of the assumptions people seem to be making, that medical applications are going to gain the most public acceptance. That's not what our work would suggest. However, the questions about health and enhancement applications were not about lack of benefit, but they were much more about social risks such as distributional justice and organizational recreancy, what our UCSB colleague Bill Freudenberg has talked about, both about governments and industry and their ability to safely and ethically manage them for the greater good. So in addition to these main findings about application context and cross-national differences, we did trace a number of highly suggestive findings regarding gender. And I wanted to just go through those with you briefly here. And these are suggestive. We would not argue that these are robust findings in themselves, but we've used them as the basis for a new study, and we've gotten new funding from NSF to do a new study that will look more systematically. But what I would call quite impoverished literature on gender effects in public participation makes these more significant. So let me just quickly run through these. First, gender and ethnicity, along with age, do seem to interact to produce distinctive patterns of discourse in the deliberative context. We saw these in terms of who talked more, who talked earlier, who talked first as new sections of the workshops opened up, the length and number of utterances, who dominated the discussion, with all of these operating in the predicted direction. That is, white male participants asserted themselves in seizing and shaping the discussion early and in claiming relatively more ownership of the domain and discussion. Women and participants of color were, as a consequence, relegated to or opted for, and I would not see those necessarily as mutually exclusive, a more minor role. Actual knowledge of nanotechnologies appeared to play little role in this process of differentiation, but interest in science and technology, as well as cultural constructions of masculinity and femininity, very likely contribute to the pattern. And if you doubt that those are serious and ubiquitous kinds of patterns, I would point out to all of you who were in the room at our keynote address yesterday, 100% of the respondents to that keynote address were persons of the male persuasion. And we had a woman speaker. We have highly educated women in the audience. These are powerful forces. They are not to be trivialized. In addition, group size mattered quite a lot to modes of participation, far more than we anticipated or the literature would lead us to conclude. So when I'm talking about group size, when we broke down from large groups of the 12 to 15 members to do World Cafe type discussions at tables with 4 or 5 people and a facilitator, women and participants of color talked more. Much more lively discussions, much more contestation. We are going to be looking much more closely at these in these new workshops. But we don't believe that those effects carried back into the reconvened larger group discussion, and that we're also going to be looking at that very carefully. So I'm not saying that perceptions of nanotech benefits and risks split neatly down gender lines, but there were strong tendencies. And age is a big factor in here as well, along with other other cross currents, and we had cross-national currents going on in general. And so men and women both were relatively positive about the benefits of nanotechnologies themselves. But women participants raised a different array of issues around risks, were impressed differently by specific expected benefits and technoscientific promises more generally. These differences were more pronounced in the health application discussion and more muted in the context of energy technologies, where perceived urgency seemed to override caution for all participants to a degree that we found quite concerning. So, and I don't have time to go through all these, but all of these, what the nature of the benefits, who will benefit, the locus of potential harm and benefit to the extent that those are differentiated, all of those are issues that were raised with more concern by people who are arguably in more contested positions, and also more concern about the role of nanotechnologies in exacerbating social inequalities. So that was articulated as a distributional justice issue. And trust, which risk perception researchers know to be an important factor in technological risk perception, trust about the social contract or environmental health and safety issues were also seemed to be gendered, with different issues, different expectations and assumptions voiced by men and women about governments, corporations, and communities' abilities and likelihood to manage technologies wisely and for social benefit. And so women in both US and UK contexts, for example, were the ones who initiated a discussion of distrust of corporations, which was a strong theme on the US side, and government's a stronger theme on the UK side. So I'm nearly at the end of my time, so I'll just sketch this for you. This new study is looking at gender as a between group variable that will allow us, even though this is qualitative research, to look much more carefully at how gender is operating in these groups through discourse analysis, through looking at the group dynamics, as well as tracing individuals from beginning to end in these contexts. And we draw on a number of different literatures to make sense of this, and I guess I would just gloss these to say we're drawing on wider intersectional feminist ideas that look at issues of what one part of the feminist literature would call the multiple oppressions, but essentially argues that you cannot disentangle the effects of race, class, gender, and other aspects of social location in California, certainly immigration status, another major one. And that those categories of difference act in concert to produce distinct positions of subjectivity, identity, and hence positionality in this. And, well, let me just wrap. So, in a sense, this project is aimed at that same global justice set of issues. We're arguing that public participation and engagement settings and the upstream deliberation opportunity that we've actually been provided with in the case, at least, of nanotech social research in the US. We're trying to ask whether, even with this opportunity, will nanotechnologies lead to greater social justice within our society and as some of the other issues we've talked about today between societies, or will they further exacerbate inequalities, including those based on gender? More equitable participation, acknowledgement and pursuit of difference, and the resultant diversity of views, which we strongly believe will enhance deliberation and enhance our collective problem solving as well, we think is essential to the participatory project's ultimate ends, and which is not to promote new technologies' acceptance, but to fully address the interests and concerns of the citizenry in all its diversity. Thank you.